Okay, can I say that's an impossible presentation to follow? Thank you. I think, since I'm the one that's following. And I'm not even sure to what extent what I wanted to talk about actually fits perfectly. So I thank the network for the opportunity to talk about it anyway. And I want to thank everyone in the network for giving us this space, for sharing ideas, to inspire each other, and as the conference theme dictates, to sharpen our vision. Because we have to constantly sharpen our vision, and we constantly have to rethink our strategy. That doesn't mean we change course willy-nilly. I think someone said it earlier. It's a long-haul fight, right? We have to stay the course. But the landscapes can change, and the obstacles in the landscape can be moved around and change along the way. So sometimes we just have to take out our map, and we have to look out at the horizon, and we have to see what is the best path. We have to ask ourselves, what's the best path right now to get to the kind of human rights society we all want? Society where there's not one more for all kinds of people, right? And that map has changed in the last number of years. I think I was a little slow to take mine out, but when I did, I realized, you know, we've all walked different paths to get to this conference today. Some of us have come from workers' rights, others from LGBTQ, some of us have been working on police brutality or the school-to-prison pipeline, healthcare, education. But all of us, I think, have had at least one experience in common, especially those of us who've been working for a while. If you think back, I ask you now to think back for just a moment, before 2011 or before 2008, and think about a community you were working in, part of, or in solidarity with, and you were dealing with some really awful stuff, right? And you thought to yourself, why are we so alone? Why is it so difficult to make anyone understand or care about what is happening in this community? How many people have had that experience here? I'm sure many of us who've been working, or certainly long enough, have had that experience. For me, that moment came in '96, actually, when they signed welfare reform, and you know, both sides of the aisle applauding it, and women I was working with, you know, they were fierce activists on the ground fighting for their dignity at the time, but the allies were few and far between. Everyone in that fight felt very alone. Well, I'm extremely unhappy to report that we are no longer alone. That today, especially after that Occupy moment in 2011, we can't stop talking about inequality as a country. Why? Because these underlying structures of inequity that continue to put the boots on the necks of poor communities and grind families into the ground, well, guess what? The virus has spread, and it has hit the middle class. And now as a country, we can't stop talking about it. Now we're talking about almost everybody's right to a decent standard of living, almost everybody's right to dignity, to housing, to quality education. Of course, not everybody is hit in the same way. Some people are crushed under student debt, and that's awful. And some people are pushed out of school before college even becomes relevant. And as we've been discussing at this conference, some of those people don't even have access to water. And that's worse than awful. So we're in a human rights landscape right now that's moving us from awful to worse than awful. And we have to pull out our maps and take stock. It took me a little while to realize that something, you know, really significant was changing. So for me, it's still an emerging issue. How do we look at this landscape that goes from awful to worse to awful? On the one hand, these large movements that are emerging are incredibly exciting. Black Lives Matter, Fight for 15, Dreamers and Dream Defenders. And these all feel to me like classic human rights movement, about and led by those most impacted by abuses. At the same time, I also see a growing fight to save democracy, for climate justice, to fight Wall Street, and against student debt and debt in general. And these fights are also human rights movement, but they're a little different because they aren't about the most impacted, because we're all impacted. So the question I've been asking myself is there a way to bring these things together? Is there some way we can strategically link these movements working on broad problems and the movements many of us are in working on deep problems? Because I fear that if we don't figure that out, it may be that in this country we successfully lessen income inequality, we maybe successfully deal with some of the debt, but that we will leave too many communities in a joyless poverty nonetheless. That if we don't figure out how to link the broad and the deep, we won't get the kind of systemic change that we need. And we won't turn what is a challenge, hopefully a challenge in disguise, into an opportunity. We need some guiding operational principles that can connect these fights. After all, they're highly linked, right? They come from the same disease. They're symptoms of the same disease. When we destroy public goods and put everything in the hands of private interests, not only do we turn the majority of this country into debtors to the wealthier class, we also create a private prison and private prisons, right, that need to be fed human lives in order to make a profit. I know that climate injustice, democracy being put up for sale, broader income inequality are tentacles of the same monstrous structures that have incarcerated a larger percentage of its people than any other country, mostly black people. And I know that for the foreclosure crisis emerged from the same toxic well that destroyed hundreds of thousands of public housing homes. But I don't always know what to do with that knowledge, how to bring awful and worse than awful together somehow, and how to ensure that those who've been suffering the most are at the center. So I don't know the answer, but I can share at least some lessons learned in some of the work we've done. I only have I thought I had 10 minutes, I got it wrong. I only have 8 minutes, so I'll use one example, which was what happened during the foreclosure crisis. You remember the foreclosure crisis? It's not over, by the way. You wouldn't know that, but it's really not over. Nonetheless, what were our biggest demands? What were our biggest demands in the foreclosure crisis that you could hear out in the world? They call principal reduction, accountability for the banks, and reining in the banks. Now, these are good things, but how is this going to help a family on minimum wage that's unlikely to ever buy a house? We put a lot of energy as movements into principal reduction, but we didn't take that opportunity to change the system, right? You can't stabilize a system that depends on instability. You can't have a system meet needs that depends on putting profit ahead of those needs. Now, today, you see a growing sort of second wave of efforts around community land trusts. This is a different model where communities own land and individuals own homes or families own homes, and you control the profit and speculation to make them permanently affordable. Now, if we were going to look at this crisis through a different lens, we would think, what kind of model would eventually be universal, as human rights require, but equitable, starting with those suffering the most? And we would start something like community land trusts, starting with those at the greatest risk of displacement or homeless, and scale it up until it was available to every family that wanted it, including the middle class. But we didn't do that, and we lost a lot of momentum, and we're still trying to catch up. We didn't do that because there was work on the broad and work on the deep, but it wasn't coming together somehow. The lessons learned for me are that we need to build relationships with those people working on the broad and those people here working on the deep. We need to frame the problems and the solution in a way that includes everyone. If it only works for the middle class, that's not going to do it. But even if it only works for the communities in poverty, that's not going to do it either. We need to do more political education to build an understanding that universal systems that put those who are suffering the most at the center are actually better for everyone. And more importantly for me, they are what justice demands. We need to build readiness for the next crisis because they're coming hard and fast, and develop more of these community-driven solutions like CLT in all the areas that we're working in, and strengthen and empower networks like this one that are focused on deep problems to connect and influence networks that are focusing on broad problems. Because there's a lot of activity out there, but we still haven't quite figured out how to bring together people who are working with universal problems with people who are working on universality and equity. And we need to continuously apply those guiding principles of if I can say them, universality and equity. If we build bridges between these movements, we can move from managing our systems to changing our systems. And as I pull out my map of the landscape, finding those bridges is starting to look like the emerging route to a human rights society for our time. For me, this is something I haven't figured out, so that's why it is an emerging issue for me. But I do hope that we get there together, because I don't think any of us can figure it out alone. Thank you.